Good morning, everyone. It's good to have everyone here again today, this morning, to the fourth in a series of webinars that are being offered in collaboration with Albuquerque Area Office. Our topic today is wellness, grief and loss, and we have a series that we'll show you later on other topics that are coming up. If you're new to the series, we covered 3 topics, which includes anxiety and depression. So I'm going through a number of topics like that. Go ahead and take the next slide, Sharon. Thank you.
Okay, let me see. I'm trying. Let's see. There we go. There we go.
There you go. Great job. Char's my TA lady this morning for us, and she's going to guide us through this stuff. And Parker joined us from Iowa to get us going. So the American Indian Alaska Native Mental Health Technology Transfer Center is part of a larger network of what they call TTCs, MHTTCs. And this map shows you where the MHTTCs are. And the MHTTCs include the American Indian Alaska Native MHTTC and the National Hispanic and Latino MHTTC. It's part of that larger network. So this shows you geographically where the other TTCs are located, what areas they cover. Next, please. SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Center, is the supporter of a grant to the National American Indian Alaska Native Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. And it's that grant that makes it possible for us to collaborate with the Albuquerque Area and Epidemiology Center, who are partners with us. Next, please. Following today's event, you will receive an email which will include links to the presentation slides and recording. This webinar is being recorded, and information about how to request and receive CEUs if that's what you desire to get. And also, just as important is a link to the evaluation survey if you've been involved with federal funding activities and programs, KIPRA. So that's a big part of what we ask each of you to do at the end of the session. Next slide. We have a land acknowledgement that we are going to go through. And this land acknowledgement was developed by 3 members of the Meskwaki Nation in Iowa. And let me take time to read this. We would like to take this time to acknowledge the land and pay respect to the indigenous nations whose homelands were forcibly taken over and inhabited. Past and present, we want to honor the land itself and the people who have stewarded it through the generations. This calls us to commit to forever learn how to be better stewards of these lands through action, advocacy, support, and education. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced occupation of Native territories, and we respect the many diverse indigenous people connected to this land on which we gather from time immemorial. While injustices are still being committed against indigenous people on Turtle Island, today we say thank you to those who stand with indigenous peoples and acknowledge that land reparations must be made to allow healing for our indigenous peoples and to Mother Earth herself. This was written up by Alan Driscoll, Kelly Driscoll, and Sean Baer, who are former members of the team from Iowa. Thank you. Next slide, please. This is me. I'm not going to take the time to read this, but you'll have this in your slide deck later on. And I should say, because we have some Navajo people on, Diné people online. My formal introduction is that I am Kia Ani. My mother's clan are Tarrowing House, and my father's clan is Many Goats. My maternal grandfathers are Sitnachini, Blackstreet people. Those are my Nullies or my Chays. Then my Nully or my Nullies people, my paternal grandparents are Bitterwater people, Twitchini. So that's who I am, and I'm from Hawk, Arizona, or Maitwai in Arizona. That's where I'm originally from. So thank you for spending time with us. Shike. Next slide. The Albuquerque Area Southwest Tribal Epidemiology Center, who Shar is with, is supporting this activity by allowing us time to be together. Next slide, please. Shar, your turn.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Charlene Pula. I'm a clinical social worker by training. I'm Hopi Tewa and Navajo. Home for me is First Mesa, Palaca, Arizona. And as Ray has been sharing with you all, this series of trainings really came from our CDC sub-awardees who were working on addressing IPV, intimate partner violence, suicide prevention, adverse childhood experiences in their communities during the time of COVID. And so they were doing a lot of outreach and education. And out of this, they wanted more training around various topics. This is our fourth topic. We had trainings on depression, signs and symptoms of anxiety, depression, suicide, ideation, and prevention. And then now is grief and loss. And our series of trainings will end in August. So it's always going to be the fourth Tuesday of every month from 9 to 10:30. And Ray Daw is our lead facilitator, and we're partnering with the University of Iowa. And we're happy to see that this group is still with us and that you're still wanting to hear about our topics. And if you have any questions, just please, raise your hand or put it in the chat. I will try my best to make sure we address some of your questions, but welcome this morning. I'll go ahead and, okay. You're on mute, Ray.
Here I am talking away. But while we're on introductions, I'd like to ask each of you to put into chat who you are, tribal affiliation, what you do, and what your interest is in joining us today. That'd be nice to know. Okay. So thank you. We'll also have a third member of the team, actually third and fourth member of the team. Dr. Dan Foster from he and his wife live in Montana. He's a member of the Rosebud Nation, clinical psychologist, and something that he likes to keep quiet is he is a former Olympian as well. One of the very few Native American Olympians from Native country. So he holds that distinction as well as being a clinical psychologist. Very fine man. I care for much. Next slide, please. Once again, this is the Albuquerque Area Southwest Tribal Epidemiology Center that we are working with today, and Char's been gracious at leading us into these sessions very well. We've tried some, well, you all know where you're from and who your partners are in this, but more particularly, some of the tribes have received 988 funding, and so we're providing some TA around that. Thank you. Next slide. And these are the particular grantees, 988 grantees that Char is working with under her umbrella that we've been asked to interact with and do work with to enhance knowledge around the 988 that helps towards doing 988 crisis line services more effectively. So I want to thank each of you for joining us for that. Next slide. We have some objectives here around the topic of grief and loss. First objective is to do an overview of signs and symptoms of grief and loss, and then have a discussion around traditional approaches that exist with grief and loss. Then have a look at what Western ways exist to help someone coping with grief and loss. The fourth objective is to have a discussion about resources that are available locally to assist our folks, people who are experiencing grief and loss. So these are 4 objectives that we're going to work through today. Next. So, what are causes of grief and grief? And these are some examples of what can cause grief. It's just a short list. It's not all inclusive. One form of grief, one cause of grief is, and something that our young people really experience in their young lives, and we've all done this too, is loss of friendship. As you're going through school, some kids change schools, friendships change, and sometimes that can be cause for grief. Loss of health, we have, especially in Native country, we have quite a strong proportion of our people who have chronic health conditions. And these chronic health conditions can cause grief because we don't have the kind of mobility or energy or capability to do the things we may have been able to do when we were healthier. So that, and loss of job is another cause for grief, and a real significant one is death of a loved one. It's cause for grief, and loss of a pet, especially now that we have service dogs and service cats and different kinds of partners who are joining people's lives a lot more consistently. And probably we can see that our 4-legged winged friends can impact our hearts when they move on. Relationships, divorce, relationship breakups do cause grief and loss, and among younger people especially, this can really contribute to the problems associated with suicide ideation, suicide attempts, and suicide deaths. And relationship breakup coupled with substance use, particularly alcohol abuse, alcohol intoxication, are 2 things that really impact suicide among our people. And this has been a major problem. And honestly, one of the reasons why the 90-day system is being set up is to look at how to connect people stronger with 90-day mental health or addiction services. And loss of financial security is another cause for grief. And particularly during the pandemic, we've seen a lot of our people experience job loss, lower loss of wages, and even more importantly for all of us, a really major, I think, a major increase in cost of living. Food has gone up, gas has gone up. We have other expenses like sanitary supplies, masking, that really add into our budget that we didn't have 4 years ago. And so I think loss of financial stability has been really significant among our people. And so these are some of the menu of things that can cause grief. Okay. If you have questions along the way, you can put it in chat or complicated grief. Oh, good question.
I had a question. This is more of a, I guess, TA question. So when I pull down the chat, can you guys see me pulling down the chat? Because I'm the one sharing my screen. No. Okay. I wanted to make sure that I'm not impacting the PowerPoint. Okay. That's it.
Yeah, I pull down the chat too sometimes. I see that Cassandra Ellen, loss of livestock, can be a significant cause for grief among ranchers, or if you're a farmer, not having the crops come out the way it's expected because of drought or other conditions, can be other factors. Cassandra, can you explain your question on complicated grief?
Well, I just recall very briefly that there was a presentation I heard where I guess I was really fascinated by this complicated grief, because I think for me personally, it explains something that maybe I was experiencing myself, because so I am a widow. I lost my husband like 12 years ago, but it's been an ongoing like issue for me. I really haven't I don't think I've really gotten over that. And so it seemed like complicated grief was something that kind of explained my situation.
That's a really good description of what we're going to look at actually in the next section.
Okay.
I think there's been a lot of attention paid to the kind of grief that you're describing. What is
okay.
generally called complicated grief now is called prolonged grief disorder within the new DSM-5 -TR. It's a revision to the DSM that was made last year actually, and now out being used. So this new identification of a disorder is really significant, and I think is really timely with what you're describing.
Yeah, I mean, it's like it says here, intense sorrow and emotional pain, but also like, I mean, my dreams, like after 12 years, they're still very real. Like he's alive in my dreams.
That's very much
it's intense.
I'm sorry, go ahead, please. Cassandra, I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No, that's fine. I was just saying that it's just really like, I'm surprised after 12 years that my dreams can be so real, and he's alive in them and I'm there with him. And
yeah,
it's like, I guess I thought, especially this last year, I thought, okay, I think I'm ready to move on. And my dreams started up again.
Well, that kind of very, very intense loving relationship that you described can be part of what contributes to what you're calling complicated grief, what is called prolonged grief disorder. The DSM calls things disorder because those are the way medical doctors kind of diagnose things, but we know that it's a lot more than that. So thank you for describing that. Next slide, please. There are some criteria for diagnosing prolonged grief disorder. One is that is when we're having experiencing grief after the death of someone at least 12 months earlier, or we have experiences of intense yearning. And I think what we're hearing is yearning, not necessarily preoccupation, because they're two different things. And that then this yearning or preoccupation has 3 of 5 symptoms that are described in the DSM. Next slide. So for diagnosis of prolonged grief disorder, there are 8 symptoms that are identified as possibly being present. One is symptoms of identity disruption, what they call identity disruption, which is feeling as though part of us has passed on also. And when we have relatives or when we experience a loss, then that loss triggers for some period of time that identity, what they're calling identity destruction. When in the Navajo way, when someone passes, we have 4 days of discussing, talking through our feelings as when someone has passed, and that's a way to begin addressing what is called identity destruction. There's a marked sense of disbelief. How can this happen? A relative passed too soon, or those kind of comments are descriptions of a sense of disbelief. The third symptom is avoidance of reminders that the person has passed. Not doing some of the things that, not going to some of the places that maybe we had gone to before with that person when they had been with us, going down the same street or stores, eating places, things like that can be examples of that. The fourth symptoms is intense emotional pain. And sometimes that pain is expressed as anger, bitterness, and more commonly, sorrow related to the relative's passing. Sorrow is probably more prominent when going through prolonged grief disorder. Then difficulty with reintegration, such like connecting with friends, kind of withdrawing and not being out in public too much, or avoiding people, not doing the same kind of things that we had done before, especially when that person was around. And then, sometimes not planning for the future as effectively or as well as we may have. Another symptom is emotional numbness, having a reduction in emotional experiences. Sadness can be expressed here, or just not being able to enjoy or laugh when funny things happen. That's an example. It also is feeling that life is meaningless. Life is not. It's not uncommon to hear, especially with young people, say that life has changed, life's not worth living anymore. Those kind of statements are examples of that. And intense loneliness, feeling alone or detached from others, not having our relationships change with people, especially family members, our children, our grandchildren, our siblings, our parents. Those relationships can change because of some of the things that are going on that's described above. So these are 8 symptoms, and to be diagnosed as with prolonged grief disorder, then 3 of these symptoms would need to be present. It doesn't mean just 3, but minimum of 3. Next slide. Someone with prolonged grief disorder might also, leave a person who's passed, leave their belongings exactly how they were before they passed. Not changing a room, or if a person who had passed had special painting they had on the wall, leaving that painting up and not wanting anyone to touch it. Having trouble remembering positive memories about the loved one, having a hard time trusting other people, difficulty making different relationships or new relationships because of that grief that is so, grief, it's not unusual to have grief make us not want to get involved with other people because the pain can be so intense. Maybe, especially with increased substance use or substance abuse. Those are other things that can happen, and suicidal thoughts and suicidal behaviors, which I mentioned are particular problems with our young people. Next slide, please. Symptoms with children. The nice thing about the diagnosis with prolonged grief disorder is that there's some attention given to children. And these are symptoms that children might have, and they might be different, waiting for the deceased person to come back. This is a common thing with younger people, especially, is them saying out loud, when is so-and-so coming, or when is so-and-so coming back to visit. And children are really good expressors of what adults feel and experience themselves. Children may want to go back to places where they last saw their loved one, become fearful that others might die. They begin to develop anxiety that way, and have magical thinking or separation anxiety. That's a fourth symptom. Then the fifth symptom can be showing very intense sadness and emotional pain through different moods. The mood swings happen a little more often. So these are 5 symptoms we can attend to when someone in our family or immediate circle passes on, is to watch for these kinds of reactions from young children and help them through a healing process. Next slide. So how do we, in the Euro-American way, psychology, psychiatry, how do they suggest treatment of prolonged grief disorder? A major approach are these ways that are described on the screen. There's a process called prolonged grief disorder therapy that can be applied by those clinicians who are experienced in that form of intervention and treatment. It's a short-term process, and if a person is going through prolonged grief disorder therapy, they discuss attachment relationships, self-determination processes, how we want to be, emotional regulation, beginning to identify how our emotions are, and being in stronger touch with our moods and how our thinking is going along. And you'll notice that these processes that are described here are looking at the symptoms that were identified earlier, and our relationships and our social self. How do we begin to reconnect or connect differently so that we make enhance our relationships with people already in our lives, or make different relationships. And there's other what they say are other psychosocial processes as well. This information comes from MedMD and WebMD, I should say. WED MD is the source for this information, and they work very closely. They're a real good source for finding information related to the DSM. Next slide. What are some traditional approaches to heal from grief and loss? And if you were with us last time, you saw this slide. In our ways, we have prayer, talking to elders, relatives, siblings, seeking help, being fit, taking care of our bodies, and singing are some of the other ways that we have available to us. Does anybody have any other thoughts on some traditional approaches that can be useful from your experience?
Hey, good morning, Ray. How are you?
Good morning.
Sorry I was late, man. My Zoom is weird. I have like 20 different Zoom accounts and it's hard for me to log in, right? But I really am enjoying this topic, and I wanted to share this in regards to the grief and loss from the traditional approach. So about 2 years ago, I was working, right? I was working in the field. I was doing a lot of peer support work, and something was happening to me, right? I was struggling bad with my mental and emotional health, right? To the point where one of my the director of what they call the traditional wellness program over at First Nations, he was like, "Hey, Moon, I had a dream about you," and it wasn't that good, right? And at that time, I was just really struggling, and people could see it. People could see that I was struggling mentally and emotionally, and it was coming out in my work, right? And he said, "We need to have ceremony." And so at this time, I wasn't too connected out here because, I come from the East Coast, and, our things are a little different, right? But the intent is the same, right? The traditional intent, the ceremonies, the intent is all the same. and he said, I'm gonna have a relative come up and help you out, right? So I participated in a ceremony, and during the ceremony, the gentleman, the medicine man, he said, you're holding on to someone. He said, wait a minute, you're holding on to two people. And those two people he was referring to were my two brothers that passed away from alcohol, right? And it's been years since they have traveled on. He said, you're holding on to them. He said, this is why you're going through these hard times, because you're thinking that they're here. He said, you need to let them go so they can go and do their work up in the spirit world, right?
Yeah.
And I didn't know that, right? And so I started to do my thing, and in my way, let them go. And what would you have known, right? I started to feel so much better, because I wasn't holding on to them anymore. I wasn't grieving over them anymore. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so if it wasn't for that ceremony, I don't know if I could have figured that out myself. You know? So
thank you for your story.
Yeah.
And you bring up a good theme around ceremony. We understand that ceremonies have what is described as traditional approaches built into them. Ceremonies have prayer, they have talking to people who are trusted healers, and ceremonies involve asking for help, seeking help, and then ceremonies involve being fit to be able to go through ceremony and songs. And so you very nicely describe these aspects of traditional approaches that are on this slide. Thank you for your story, Mo. Thank you very much. Next slide, please. And thank you, Candace and Cassandra, for your comments on other ways, and Candace, especially burning cedar and making an offering that way. Thank you. We have a colleague in Oklahoma, Dolores Bigfoot, D Bigfoot. She likes to be known as D. When I saw this graphic shown by D several years ago, I asked her if I could include this in some of the teachings that I get involved in. It's a really nice graphic on spiritual ways that are therapeutic in our indigenous processes. And these indigenous ways include humility, acceptance, generosity, respect, and acknowledgement. And I think Moo's description of what he went through includes those 5 aspects. And we see ceremonies listed there, listening, storytelling. And these are therapeutic practices that we know can be very beneficial for us. And with prolonged grief disorder, grief and loss, many of us go through these indigenous practices, or seek these indigenous practices as a way to begin to regain our humility, regain our acceptance, which is a big part of resolving grief, and regain our generosity to ourselves and to each other, and also to begin to respect that process of passing on, and to begin to acknowledge our lives, our relationships, and then the process of passing on that all of us and our relatives experience. So this is a really nice graphic from T. Bigfoot. She's a really wonderful lady. Next slide, please. If you have reactions to this, please put them in chat. Now, what are some of the? I'm one of those people who I don't particularly like using the word Western. I prefer Euro-American. That's my way of decolonizing. So I would read this: what Euro-American ways exist to help someone coping with grief and loss? And these are important things to know, because not all of our relatives are traditionally oriented, and a good portion of our relatives are acculturated and assimilated in the Euro-American ways. But there are a number of ways number of teachings and processes that are out there in the Euro-American system to work at attempting to explain a grieving process. And this is the major one. If you're doing work in clinical work, you probably have some good understanding of the Kubler-Ross grief cycle. It has five parts to it: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. For the longest time, this was kind of acknowledged as a kind of the way to look at grief and understanding of grief process. And there are assessment tools that are built around the Kubler-Ross grief cycle. This is one of the premier forms of understanding how people cope. Next slide, please.
A question,
Yeah, please.
is there, like, just out of curiosity, like
Mhm.
this, you mentioned the Euro-American 5 stages of the grieving process.
Mhm.
Do you have knowledge of whether there is a grieving process from the Native perspective?
That is very tribal specific. I understand that traditional tribal ways across all our tribes in the country are different. The Navajo process is different. Navajo traditional process is different from the Lakota way, for example. And when we speak to a healer from a tribe, they can speak to your question in that language. Dinecha, is we have very specific Diné words and ways to understand. Like our words for when someone passes on is dahantitsa, for example,
Oh.
they moved on. And that's a very big difference from the process involved with the word loss, for example, that is not included in the traditional Navajo description. So it's very tribal specific and can be explored a lot more that way. There are attempts by groups like the Wellbriety folks, for example, to do a broader Native American approach to understanding grief that is specific to what they teach. But that's the best answer I can give you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your question. And then there are other ways of understanding. There are other ways to begin understanding grief within the Euro-American system. There's one model that's identified, the Burnett Regional Funeral Services Group, that says that there are 7 stages of grief, not 5, but 7. And you'll see that written here. And there are other ways of doing that. Next slide. So what I'm doing here is showing you that within the Euro-American system, there's not just one way of understanding grief, let alone the DSM system that's out there that talks about prolonged grief disorder. There are other groups, other thinkers within the Euro-American system that says this is probably how grief works. And in this model, there are 5 steps, five things that are described in grieving from when we're functioning, whatever normal is, to returning to a meaningful life. And in this model, it talks about how grieving is not staged like this. It's not just like this, but it is a process of cycling through these feelings and events. Next slide, please. Thank you for joining us, Marie. There are additional models other than the graph type. There's a model that is more circular that looks at grief from this perspective, and it separates grief in terms of how it can happen and some of the reactions that can go with it. You know, one of the areas that our people have particular interest is around ancestral grief, sometimes called historical grief or intergenerational grief, intergenerational trauma, I should say, or historical trauma. And that is here in this model described as ancestral grief, which can be tied back to slavery, genocide, and some events that happen, natural disasters, effects of war, for example, can be examples of ancestral grief. So these are some models that you can look at as you move along, as you look at the slides and contemplate which model might be good to learn more about, or even learn more about all of them. There's a lot of literature out there, a lot of books. And the point here is that there are quite a few different approaches in the Euro-American system around understanding grief. But when we narrow it down to like the NES system, the NES way of doing it, our ways are very clear cut, and they're prayers, songs, ceremony. We say, there are ways of doing things that are specific to our people. Like one of the first steps we do in Navajo is Intesh, having a blackening ceremony. That can be a few hours or a few hours to a lot of hours, even a prolonged ceremony that can cover several days. And that's how we are. But a lot of tribes have ways that are different and sometimes similar. Next slide. So what are some resources that are available to us? We all experience grief. We all do, especially within the last 3 years with the pandemic. We have all experienced relatives passing on, young relatives, our generation or my generation and older. We've seen a lot of that. And these resources that are out there help us stay in the present. They help us connect with others, support groups. They help create or recreate memories, and they give us opportunities to ask for support and help. And the important thing to this is acknowledging our feelings. And grief is not new to me or you or anybody. It is there in our hearts every day, and it is how we acknowledge that feeling and live our life the best way we can and take care of each other. Developing new rituals is a part of that.
I just wanted to say with regards to for kids, that is so hard to understand where they're at when they don't know how to vocalize what they're feeling or what they're experiencing.
Yeah, and then kids vocalize in a different. You're right about that. Kids vocalize in their behaviors. If you look at the symptoms of youth grief, prolonged grief experiences, you'll see it a lot of is in the behavior. And that's how it becomes really important to be able to look for nonverbal cues. And be able to respond to nonverbal cues and be able to heal those nonverbal cues that can be impactful. Next slide, please. Grief has all these responses, reactions, ways in there. And this is the purpose for having these conversations around these topics that we have, is to bring it to what we're here for, and to really encourage us to teach, make available to our relatives this 988 system that's there. I think I mentioned a couple of months ago that I'm a real firm believer that this new crisis system that is there now is intended to be more responsive, is intended to be helpful, and intended to begin a healing process. It's not intended to heal, but intended to begin a healing process. And I would, one of the things I do in my work is if I'm talking about 988, I'll ask the person I'm talking to call the number, for example, just to call it and see, experience what happens. And so I would say that this is a nice way to begin helping our relatives and helping our relatives in a way that's meaningful to them. Not only do we have a call-in center nationally, but we're working in this state to build a native call-in process as well. And I really encourage you to look at the Facebook page, the Instagram page, and the website. You see in the back of my screen, the 988 banner, I guess you could call it. This banner comes from the website that's listed there, 988nm.org. If you're curious about what other things are going on in Native country, you might want to do a hashtag Native 988 as a way to see what's happening in other parts of the country among Native people and programs. But this is something I think is very important to us. Next slide, please. And here we come to our case study, Shar.
Hi, everybody. So we always like to do a case study just so that we can apply the information we learned, especially the signs and symptoms. And we just ask that through this case study that you identify some of the signs and symptoms of grief and loss or prolonged grief that you just learned about, but also think about some other traditional ways that you, if you were the clinician in helping this individual out, think of other traditional ways that might assist this man who lost his wife. It was during the height of COVID. This, I would have to say probably early 60s, lost his wife and 25-year-old son to COVID. And then he lost his oldest son to a car accident. So within 3 years, he lost his entire family, and it was just him, the only survivor. He was not motivated to get out of bed or assist with anything. He used to be pretty active. The way he was able to get out of bed or even have some semblance of, engaging in society is that he kept in touch with his in-laws and would often visit them to keep his spirits up because they would help remind him of certain memories or good memories. But when he would return home, where he shared his home with his wife and younger son, he would isolate himself and often would cry and not engage with anybody. He was easily agitated, got angry right away over little things. His patience was very, very low. He used to engage in cultural activities, but the tribe closed all the activities during COVID for the safety of their members and elders. So he couldn't even rely on some of his traditional practices for almost 2.5 years. He felt lost, had no one to talk with. He often felt guilty because he was not unable to see his wife and younger son when they were hospitalized for COVID. So he was constantly talking about this and had those reminders. He said his pain was excruciating and often feels like he can't go on. He has a close relationship with his mom and sisters and came to the office and asked for some assistance, asking for help because he just couldn't deal with all this pain anymore, and finally reached out. So in what you've learned today, what are some of the signs and symptoms of grief that you're seeing? Or even before that, what do you think is really going on here? Let's just start with that before we go into signs and symptoms. Can you guys relate to the scenario?
Yes, definitely can relate.
We've all lost a lot of great people in our lives, our family, relatives, and friends during COVID. And when we didn't have access to our traditional ways, practices,
Mhm.
that really did hurt our spirits, right? And we had
Yeah.
to figure out a new way of engaging and keeping our spiritual wellness. Anything else? You guys are quiet this morning.
That he was able to be with his mom and his sisters, but he would fall right back into that isolation as soon as he would separate from them. I think that can happen to people easily.
Yeah. Is that a normal response?
No, I mean, I was just gonna say that, like, this is kind of like a normal response to losing a wife and a son, right?
Mhm.
And I think I'm reading this and I'm like, well, he hasn't dived into substances to cope or to numb. So that's a
Yeah.
good thing, right? And he's reaching out after a year. So like how can we take that? How can we take that, him reaching out after a year of his wife and his son passing, and turn that into ceremony? Because oftentimes we do that. Oftentimes we go through a year of grief and then we have to start that healing process of letting them go, you know? So maybe this is a perfect time for him to come into the office and ask for that help.
Yeah. That's a positive, right? He's recognizing, hey, I can't keep doing this. I need to do something different. And maybe he doesn't recognize what that different means yet, but with help from a behavioral health organization, they could talk about, here are some signs and symptoms of grief, but also, what are some of your traditional ways, that you can incorporate. So you're exactly right. This is a normal response to grief and loss, or to losing a loved one. Anything else?
I also want to add that I can't imagine after losing his family, like him feeling like he's the only one and there's no one else after him. I think that's what's hurting him the most. And I'm sure that's why he has low patience, because he's angry. And um, I honestly, that's what I feel for him, because he doesn't realize that he has his community there for him. That's part of his family too. But I think that's what hurt him, is the closest ones to him, and not having them and not having anyone after him.
Yes. Going to a home where it's just him now, right? And not the family members. Was a daily reminder. And I remember him saying that at his in-laws, at least it kept his spirits up. They would joke with him, they would laugh with him, and that really helped him get through some things. And obviously his mom and his sisters were there locally to check on him on a daily basis. So that was a positive. Thanks for sharing, Cynthia. Anyone else? What would be some of your recommendations for him? Obviously listening, right? Active listening, hearing his story. What are some things you'd want him to have in his toolkit before he left your office?
Resources.
Resources, yeah. Definitely resources. What kind of resources do you think?
988, get them connected with a case manager, get them connected with an on-call therapist and all that. I know during COVID, like you all said, we all lost someone we loved. I lost my dad during COVID too, and we couldn't see him We video chatted with him, but he couldn't hear. It was difficult because there was so much restriction, and it was not allowing our culture and our native culture to say, yes, you can come, but we couldn't say our goodbyes like how we used to say our goodbyes. We didn't. They allowed us 1 hour to go in there and pray with him the day before, and I can't imagine what he was feeling. He probably was feeling so depressed and lost. The guilt is probably because, the COVID restriction was, not allowing him to be in there for his wife. And, my mom suffers through that too. We try to constantly encourage her. I call her every day. She has friends where she's at that she talks to every day. So, setting them up with close friends that check on them.
Exactly, right? Just sometimes hearing from an aunt, an uncle, or a cousin, good morning, how are you doing? Was thinking about you. Even those simple words really mean a lot, right? To all of us, that someone is thinking about you, hope, and praying probably for you and good thoughts your way. So you're right, that connection to relatives, friends, an online therapist, or someone who's on call therapist is really important to make sure that he feels this connection and support, that they want him to get better with time. Because, it takes a lot of time to heal from losing a whole family. And, he's definitely doing better. The activities have opened up where he's from, the cultural doing. So he's involved in that more, and you could see the pep in his walk. And so I feel like our spiritual ways, our traditional ways is really gives us that spiritual lift that we need. And if we have that in tandem with some of the Eurocentric therapeutic ways, that's a blessing, that's a blessing.
I wanted to add that Cynthia had kind of, I think, touched on it, but that, he was angry because he lost, his whole family and it's just him at home. But something that was mentioned earlier in one of the earlier slides was that just that loss of identity. Like, what is my role now? Who am I? What's my purpose? Because, when you're a husband or a wife, you have a purpose. When you're a parent, you have a purpose. But if you lose all of that, then who are you? What you don't know which way to go. You don't know what to do. But the other thing too is, like, with engaging in cultural activities, I think that some of the things we had to come back to during COVID was practicing those prayers ourselves, the ceremony ourselves, like we had to do for ourselves. We did it individually, and then we did it collectively as individuals, but I think that sometimes we forget, maybe just that individual spirituality that we can do that anytime, anywhere, any place. But that's definitely something I would encourage him to do, because it sounds like he was engaged in those cultural activities. To come back to that.
I like
he's practicing.
Yeah, I like the way you framed it, that what's his purpose, right? He, like you said, we all have roles in our families, and his family was gone within like 2-3 years. And so now he's having to identify, how do I move forward as just me? And so I think that definitely would played a role in him trying to figure out what's this journey for me from here on out? How do I proceed? So you're absolutely right. I think he had to find that new identity. A friend of mine shared recently that he lost his mother, and he has siblings, but he was probably the primary caretaker of his mother, who was 90 years old, 95, I think. And losing her, he lost his sense of purpose because he looked forward to, he was always there with his mom, doing things with his mom. He said, even though she lived, a good long life, it still was, he lost his sense of purpose. So he's working through that now. So you're right. I think losing a loved one, a close loved one, is going to impact our identity and our purpose. Anything else that you guys could add to this case study?
I wanted to piggyback on Cassandra. That was a really good point she made in regards to doing like connecting back to ceremony like ourselves. I remember during COVID, we lost a really influential person, especially back on the East Coast. And he was influential in my life. He was a powwow singer, very well known throughout Indian country. And I remember my uncle calling me and says, we're not able to give him the proper sending home ceremony. So we're going to do something for the family, just us. And we use technology, right? We used technology and we had a Zoom call and we had a pipe ceremony via Zoom. And we were thinking to ourselves, this is a little weird, but it was the intention, right? What is our intention? And the intention will be the same if we were in person, right? And so we just had to be okay with it, letting the creator know that, and the family know that our intent is to support and to offer those prayers or condolences, and hopefully those prayers, help that family heal. So I wanted to mention that because I think Cassandra made a really good point about that.
We had to adapt our traditional ways, right? And do things different during COVID when it came to ceremony, when it came to our traditional ways, definitely. And then I remember I was thinking about like when we're a little more open, at least here in New Mexico, our tribal communities, some are open now where they're practicing some of their traditional ways. And for me, when I went home for our Easter doings, I was like, all of us were like, oh man, I forgot how to do this. I forgot how to make this certain meal. Oh, is it after this dance we go in, or is it the second? Like we were all trying to recall what we were supposed to do in our roles. And so I know, talking to other friends, they had similar experiences because we hadn't been home, at least for some of us, in a few years because the communities were closed down. So relearning and re-engaging.
For me, it was kind of interesting during COVID, like when we had to stop. We couldn't gather for ceremony, but I grew up with my grandparents and my great-grandparents and my great-grandparents as kids. So, and my grandparents is like relatives. And so and I was the only grandchild. And during that time, there was the boarding school era. So all the kids were away and I was the only one home with all of these adults. But we lived in a very remote place. And my grandparents, we lived in a hogan with a dirt floor and no electricity, no running water. But ceremony from what I remember as a kid it was just us. It was just maybe just a few of us. It wasn't like these large gatherings, and not until maybe certain times of the year, but for most part, it was just a few of us. And so it was, to me, I was just kind of, I guess I was okay with it. I was okay with not having to have these big gatherings because I was like, well, that's not really how I recall ceremony had to be. It's just with whoever's, they're close to you. Just wanted to share that.
Yeah, that is a good reminder. That I'm sure back in the day, it was just the closest families that were there in that community that would gather. And now we have bigger, larger families now, and there's more people. But thanks for that reminder, Cassandra. Anyone else want to add? No.
Amanda had some comments, Sharon, that maybe she can share her thoughts.
So Amanda's saying maybe don't give him more things he should do, just support what he can do at a given time. Yeah, start where he's at, right, Amanda? Provide him the loving support, and that the small things he's able to do, he's doing the best he can, right? What is that? Prochaska and Di Clemente, start where they're at, stages of change, stages of readiness. Definitely support him where he's at. And just these smaller, not smaller, but just even one little step towards healing, that's one step closer, right? And so he is doing the best he can. You're right, Amanda. Did you want to elaborate on that?
Well, I just remember I went through something very difficult. And the other thing that was not helpful to me was when people could try this, and I was so exhausted that just adding to my list of things that I could try to do to feel better or to quote unquote get better, it was not, when I look back, it was not helpful. It was, I also I have like a delayed reaction to grief. So when something happens, I tend to be okay, but then I'm not okay. And so people would say, how come you're handling this so well? You're doing so well, or how can you get out of bed? And then it was very confusing to me, because then when I experienced the part of not being able to get out of bed, people were like, why can't you get out of bed? It was like, let me just heal in my own way. Let me just have my own timeline. So, yeah, or sometimes having other people, this is how this person did it. For me, in the real darkness, that was just very confusing, and was a message of like how I already felt a lot of shame and grief and all that darkness. And then they were telling me I'm not healing right. So that was really, really hard. And I remember when I spent a lot of years in counseling, and at the end I asked my counselor, she said I was the picture of mental health, which I do not think that is true. But I said, well, what was my other option? And she said, failure to thrive. And I was like, oh, I didn't even know that. So this person here in this case, that could happen, right? He's lost his whole thing. I'm really touched by this story, and just what it could be like to walk in his shoes right now. So anyway, I'm sorry. I don't talk a lot because I tend to go on and on. So thank you for your patience.
No, thank you for sharing, because that's right. We all have different ways of healing, and our journey is going to be different from, our neighbors, other relatives, other friends. It's just supporting them through those activities and ensuring their safety, right? Make sure they're safe and connected to someone that they trust. And eventually, through time, with love and support from others, hopefully they'll get to the point where they're like, I got a little pep in my walk and I'm feeling good today, right? That's what we want. We want people to feel good when they wake up out of bed, or when there's something good that happens in their life, to celebrate those good events in their life. So thanks for sharing, Amanda. Somebody said very powerful failure to thrive. I've never really heard that, but I think that's more on a clinical side, failure to thrive. Anything else that you guys would like to add? I chose this case study because a lot of some of our sub-awardees talked about how much they've lost people during COVID, and how they weren't able to do the traditional ceremonies of going over to the house and paying their respects to the families. And there was guilt associated with that, because they weren't practicing some of those traditional ways, but they did call, or they did send their condolences. So And then when things started to open up, there was still that guilt associated because I didn't come over and say and hug you and send my sincere condolences. And so, I think our families, the families that lost loved ones, and if you sent their condolences via text, Zoom, whatever it might be, they remember it. They remember it. And so it was just a way to reiterate what we've all been through, but to walk through our own processes and to share our stories. That's how we heal too sometimes. So that's why I put this case study together. Any other questions or comments before we go on to the next slide? Thank you all for your feedback. This is really good. I'm learning.
Mm.
Do you want to do this slide, Ray?
Yeah, you can do that. I really appreciate the discussion from our relatives who joined us today. And as I mentioned earlier, we do all go through experiencing grief, and different ways depending on where we are at that time in our life. And I appreciate that we have this opportunity to spend time together and share our thoughts and our feelings. And like Shar said, I learn as much as anybody else, I think, from the times that I have with others and with you. So thank you for that. And I felt that it was good to go through the content the way we did, kind of in a rushed way, but nonetheless give some explanation to what each of you can build on in your work, give you other opportunities to learn beyond what we go through in these webinars. Because what we're doing in these webinars is basically a survey on topics and giving opportunity to build on the learning and experiences that we have in these sessions, and continue building more efficient services that are effective for our people. So with that, next month, our topic will be post-traumatic stress disorder. And we'll go through that, and then July we'll have a session on suicide ideation. And then in August we'll do a session on substance abuse and use. And then in August will be our last session, our last time together officially here, but we'll basically do it like a closeout session, and be able to process all these themes that we've looked at, and bring it all back to the work we're looking to accomplish under the 98 program, and how we can engage ourselves a lot closer to the systems that are being designed in 98, but also within our tribal communities around us. Also noticed that we have a number of people who are not from New Mexico, and I want to welcome each of you to continue joining us. You're welcome to share your knowledge and experiences with us as well. So that's how it is. Anything, Sharon?
Yeah, I'm reading in the chat. Candace was asking, how do we work around family members that do not understand mental health disorders and or have a conservative way about thinking about mental health?
Mm-hmm. Any thoughts to that, anybody?
Can you repeat that, Shar?
Sure. She said, what are some ways, let me see, how do we work around family members that do not understand mental health disorders and or have a conservative way of thinking about mental health? And one person wrote, just be there with them. I think I've been in those situations, and I just try to gently drop little seeds of information and education and awareness.
Mm.
You know, I don't try to bombard them with too much information, because, you know, just like any human being, when you're flooded, you're like, this is too much. I gotta step back. You're giving me way too much information. But I just like to drop little seeds here and there about, well, think about it this way, you know, and just get their opinion and kind of leave it alone for a while, let them simmer on it, and then maybe come back and address it a while later. That's how I've done it with family members. And it takes time. I don't know about anybody else, but it does take a lot of time. So that's my one recommendation. I don't know, anybody else have recommendations?
I have one. So my mom and my family, we I don't know how far out in the family, but for us, there was a long years and years of there's no such thing as depression. You're just being lazy. And so one day I just told my mom, like, Mom, like, I don't want to get out of bed. I have no motivation to go throughout my day. And I guess one day I just told her, like, Mom, sometimes, like, you just have to understand, whether you don't, even though you don't understand, you kind of have to, like, stop pushing the person and say, you know what, maybe there is depression, or at least consider it. And then let me speak to you about how I'm feeling, and then maybe you can talk to someone that may or have not gone through the same thing that I'm going through. And then slowly break that stigma in the family about depression, because it exists.
You're absolutely right. Hearing it from another person too sometimes, right? Who understands. Yeah. Oh, thank you for sharing, Cynthia.
I have a biological mother and father, and I have a stepmother and a stepfather. And my step parents are a lot easier to go to, because my my biological parents are crazy. No, I'm just kidding. If you know my biological parents, don't tell them I said that. But no, it's but really, honestly, like, I mean, I can go to my stepdad. I don't call him my stepdad, but I can go to him and talk to him about what I'm feeling, and then he will try to, I think, help my mom understand sometimes. Same with my stepmom. I don't call her my stepmom. Like, she'll go to my dad and try to explain stuff to him, or they can help me try to understand that other person's perspective a little bit. So that's how I kind of navigate things sometimes.
Thank you, Cassandra. That's important. It's so odd that we can receive information from other people, right? Like, and maybe our defenses don't go up, our alarms don't go up, but when we hear it from other people that maybe we're not close to it, it's easier to digest sometimes. I don't know if people feel the same way too. Anybody else have other strategies or recommendations? Candace, I hope this helped, those recommendations. Sometimes having another ally talk to the relative or the family member does help. My husband teases me because he says my dad and I are exactly alike, so we bump heads a lot. So he's usually the one that talks to my dad when it comes to stuff. Like, for some reason, my dad's able to digest it a little easier coming from him than me. And maybe because he's the in-law, you know, and it's not me. But yeah, I think that is one good strategy. I hope you guys enjoyed this session. We're midway through, and like Ray was saying, the next topic is going to be on PTSD, and then suicide ideation and substance use. Our last session will be in August. So please fill out the evaluations. That's very helpful for us to continue to do this work. If you have any questions and you want to talk about this more and need more information or resources, please feel free to email me or Ray. Cassandra has her hand up. We're more than willing to talk with you.
I just want to add before you close that, you know, there's a lot of sessions I go to, webinars and stuff that are given, and clinical staff will participate and whatnot. But I have to tell you, I really like these sessions because you guys do such a great job in bringing in the traditional perspective, no matter what, you know, tribe we belong to. But I just want to really just extend my gratitude to you all for that.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Ray?
Well, the webinars are a collaboration. You know, Shar has a major role in guiding what we put together, and I want to acknowledge her energy, empathy, and what we jointly work on. My brother Dan Foster up in Montana contributes too, although he doesn't join us on the call. So bounce ideas off him, and we share knowledge that way. But I want to, and all of you do. I really enjoyed this session too, because I gain from your insights and the shared healing we're going through. We're going through a shared healing process, relatives. We are. And that explains how this session we put in more time for dialogue, so that we could share a little bit more with each other. And I enjoy these times with each of you. But with that, there is closing comments. Yeah, Cassandra, you're right. We're going through shared healing, and more this way, which like paperwork kind of stuff. If you have any thoughts, you know, there are 3 other topics that we're going through, and Chad, I gave my email address. If you have any ideas or thoughts on those topics coming up, feel free to share them with me. Okay, and so that we can continue making these times that we have with you good for all of us. All right. What's that?
Yes. You guys have a good week. Enjoy your weekend. Be safe. Enjoy the outdoors. It's spring.
Yeah. Stay off I-40 because I'll be on the road. Okay.
I hope.
You guys have a safe holiday weekend.
Thank you very
You
much.
too. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Okay. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.